In a relatively short period of time, so I encourage you to just hold on to any questions or comments you may have till the end, and I will try as many questions as I can. If not here at the tail end of this, then downstairs, because we plan to go downstairs and have a meet and greet and a meal and whatnot. My name is James Bartley. I've been doing UFO alien abduction research for nigh on 25 years now, and the two things that I focus on most is the actual alien encounters, i.e. face-to-face encounters that people have with non-human intelligences, whether those intelligences be extraterrestrial, subterranean, in other words, or interdimensional, in all its forms, whether it's an astral experience, a physical experience, telepathic experience, so on and so forth. And another facet of my research has always been the military aerospace connection to the alien UFO subject. What I've come to understand, and many before me have come to understand, is that the powers that be have always regarded the subject of UFOs, alien craft, alien intelligences, not as a subject of scientific curiosity, but rather a subject that reeks of security implications, of defense implications, not just from the standpoint of defending oneself or one's nation from any real or potential threat, but also from the standpoint of weapons acquisition, as far as the back engineering of recovered technology, which is going to be a big part of this talk. Some of you that have been in this field for a long time may have heard some of this information before, so some of it will be a rehash for some of you. For those of you that are relatively new to this subject, I will start from the beginning of the modern UFO era. And I choose the 1940s because it is a convenient point in time right near the center of the 20th century. By so doing, I'm glossing over certain events that have transpired before. There was an alleged crash of an alien craft in 1897 in Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, apparently. Jim Mars, some of you are familiar with his work, has done research on this. And there was military research and scientific research conducted by a number of nations in the 1920s, 1930s, and on to the present time. But I'm really going to begin my efforts today in the 1940s. The person you're looking at now is Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Hugh Dowding, for those of you who have studied World War II history, was the head of Royal Air Force Fighter Command, RAF Fighter Command, during the Battle of Britain. For those of you that are familiar with the history, conventional history tells us that the Germans were prepared to invade Great Britain, but only after the German Air Force subjugated the British Royal Air Force to pave the way for an amphibious landing, so-called Operation Sea Lion, that was never really intended to be, but that's a whole other story. But the Battle of Britain has come down in the annals of history as an example of a relatively few fighter pilots fighting against what seemed to be hordes of German fighters, German bombers, and German air squadrons. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was the commander of RAF Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. He played a key role in bringing science and modern techniques such as radar into the picture in order to create a distant early warning for the relatively few Royal Air Force fighter squadrons. They had to be able to detect the incoming German bomber squadrons, and with the use of radar and communications, vector the fighter planes to intercept the German squadrons. And for those of you that are familiar, the war got quite technologically advanced. There was the so-called Battle of the Beams, where the Germans were emitting a certain directional homing beacon for the bomber squadrons to focus on at night. And then the British scientists had to find a way to bend the beams, to using electronic countermeasure efforts to make the homing beacons point in another direction so the Germans would wind up bombing an empty field or something. But Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding played a key role in that. Now, the point of relevance with the UFO research is that he was basically sacked shortly after the Battle of Britain. He did his part. He prevented the German Air Force from defeating the Royal Air Force, and then, for whatever reason, he was cashiered. And they threw him a bone afterwards. They made him an Air Chief Marshal. Now, after World War II, he privately embarked on his own UFO research. He told people privately that he considered flying saucers to be serious business. Again, this was not a scientific curiosity to the military-minded people. This was a subject that reeked of defense implications. Air Chief Marshal Dowding was interested in flying saucer reports. He regarded it as a serious business. What he was particularly interested in was the reports of contacts between humans and the occupants of these alien craft. So we've been told by the mainstream media, by academia, etc., that people who believe in flying saucers are generally crazy, that they're just falling off of a turnip truck, that they're not credible, so on and so forth. And there's a reason why there's this mainstream perception that the subject is absurd, that the subject is not worthy of scientific consideration. Just to backtrack a little, why do we have this perception? Why do we have this perception that the subject of UFOs and alien life forms is ridiculous? It's because on 2 successive weekends in July 1952, alien spacecraft flew over the restricted area of the White House in Washington, D.C. On 2 successive weekends, the flying saucers were observed by civilian airline crews, was painted on airborne and ground-based radar, and military personnel and military fighter planes were vectored after these flying saucers that swarmed over Washington, D.C. on 2 successive weekends, the weekend of July 19th, 1952, and then the subsequent weekend, July 26th, 1952. This resulted in the largest post-World War II military press conference, where at the time the head of Air Force Intelligence, U.S. Air Force Intelligence, General John Samford, as well as General Roger Ramey, gave a press conference to allay the concerns of the public. General John Samford said what had happened was that the radar operators had detected temperature inversions, which is basically a way of saying that the heat that radiated off the pavement created echoes in the sky, which the radar operators had mistaken for flying objects, which was absurd. But they had to tell the public something. The media had went into a state of hysteria. Back then, the media actually asked serious questions in 1952. Fast forward to 1953, January 1953, a scientist, Dr. H.P. Robertson, who did a lot of work with the acquisition and the development of German weapon systems obtained during World War II. His name was Dr. H.P. Robertson. He convened a panel known throughout history as the Robertson Panel of the CIA. And the long and the short of it was, the Robertson Panel came up with a paradoxical, curious finding. The UFOs they didn't call them UFOs at the time, let's just call them flying saucers, did not pose a threat to national security. However, the potential that mass sightings of flying saucers, can engender hysteria within the mass populace was a threat to national security. So, in order to allay public interest in the subject, a comprehensive CIA program to debunk UFO sightings, utilizing the corporate media as an accomplice to ridicule witnesses. So that became an agenda in 1953, January. It was an institutionalized policy by the CIA to utilize elements within the corporate media to ridicule witnesses and use academics to debunk sightings, explain everything away as either a hoax or a natural phenomenon that's been misidentified. And yet here we have the head of RAF Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, saying that UFOs, flying saucers, are serious business. Moreover, he is particularly interested in reports of encounters between the occupants of said alien craft and human beings. So there's a built-in contradiction there. Dr. Doolittle, Dr. James Doolittle. He was the commander of 8th Air Force during World War II. He was the leader of the famed Doolittle raid of B-25 Mitchell twin-engine bombers that flew off of the American aircraft carrier Hornet, which had this raid on Japan, which was really just for propaganda value. He was also, if memory serves, the very first person issued a doctorate in aeronautical engineering by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. So as far as I know, he was the very first person ever to be issued a doctorate in aeronautical engineering. He was a scientist, essentially, and an engineer. He was also a daredevil pilot. In the 1920s and 1930s, he set a number of speed records, a number of distance records, flying a variety of craft. He used to be a barnstormer. He would literally be a wing walker on some of these planes, doing stunts for crowds and whatnot. World War II found him, like I said, he was the leader of the raid on Japan. He was also the head of the 8th Air Force, the mighty 8th, that was based in Britain in World War II, which conducted the mass terror raids against civilian populations in Europe. After World War II, he went back to civilian life as an executive with the Shell Corporation. And if some of you are familiar with the research of Robert Woods and I forget the name of it, it's a father and son combination, the Woods, the Majestic papers. In some of those Majestic papers that have been leaked out selectively over the years, General Doolittle, in his guise as Dr. Doolittle of the Shell Corporation, sat in on a number of high-level meetings involving the recovery of alien craft and the back engineering of alien craft. But let's back up to 1946. 1946 was a year after World War II. In Sweden, they were experiencing what they were called the ghost planes, the ghost ships. What was happening was there were mass sightings of like rocket-shaped or cigar-shaped craft that were coming over seemingly from the Arctic Circle and flying over the airspace of Sweden. This was so alarming to the Swedish government, the Swedish military. They asked the Americans and the British for assistance in their investigations. The Americans sent over Dr. Doolittle. And again, he's one of those people that wears multiple hats. He's a guy with high-level intelligence connections. Later on in his career, Dr. Doolittle was a key member of the President's Advisory Panel on Intelligence. I forget the exact name of the group. But he played a high-level role in the intelligence community, General Doolittle as well. When Doolittle went to Sweden to conduct his investigations about the so-called ghost ships, speaking to a number of military people, scientists, eyewitnesses, he came away with the feeling that what the people were seeing, what was being reported, were not Russian planes, they were not Russian missiles, they were not a natural phenomena that was misidentified. There was something that was unusual going on in the skies of Sweden. Again, we have another example of high-level interest from a personage of major historical significance. Just to fast forward, I'm going to do that a bit in this lecture because some of these people played a key role in the investigation of alien technology at various stages throughout their careers that spanned decades. Later, it was understood that General Doolittle played a key role in the study of alien technology at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where a lot of the recovered alien craft was taken to in the early days. He worked closely with Dr. Jerome Hunsaker, who was an aeronautical engineer and was an alleged member of MJ-12, Majestic 12. I'm sure some of you have heard about this super secret group that was set up in the wake of the flying saucer recoveries in the late 1940s. Another famous military personality, Air Force General Nathan F. Twining. General Nathan Twining was the commander of Com Air Sols in the Pacific in World War II. Com Air Sols was commander Air Force's Solomon Islands, which was a multinational, multi-branch organization, an Air Force organization in the Pacific in the early stages of World War II. After his stint as commander of Com Air Sols, he was transferred to North Africa, where, if memory serves, he was commander of North African Air Forces, eventually became commander of the 15th Air Force. The 15th Air Force, after the occupation of Italy, after Italy surrendered and after the so-called Allies had conquered enough of Italy to establish forward bases, the 15th Air Force set up shop in Italy, with which they staged to bomb targets in Germany, Romania, and elsewhere. After World War II, he became the commander of the Air Material Command at Wright Field. Wright Field later became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. At the time of Roswell, General Nathan Twining was the commander of Air Material Command at Wright Field. Air Material Command was the repository. It was the main hub where the Army Air Forces, later became the Air Force, kept a lot of their technology and did a lot of studies. They also have branches within Air Material Command and that whole Wright Field setup, like the Foreign Technology Division, FTD, which some of you have heard about. Also within Wright Field and later Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was the Office of Special Studies, which also had at times the aforementioned General James Doolittle working with the Office of Special Studies with a scientist, a very obscure individual named Dr. Eric Henry Wang, who was a metallurgist of Viennese origin. But anyway, General Nathan Twining, at the time of Roswell, he was scheduled to go to Washington State, to the Boeing factory, to inspect if memory serves, a B-29 Superfortress plant. There is correspondence which shows that he had to cancel his appearance at the B-29 plant in Washington State because of a very serious matter that had suddenly occurred in New Mexico, which we know as the Roswell event, or events, because in truth it was probably more than one UFO alien crash that had occurred in Roswell over a span of several days in July of 1947. General Nathan Twining eventually became Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force and became the first Air Force general to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. military. In other words, commander of all U.S. forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. He was the first Air Force general to reach that rank of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He wrote or signed off on what was known as the Twining Memo. The Twining Memo is a key piece of documentation obtained via the Freedom of Information Act. And it must be understood, I was in military communications in the past, and I've drafted and I've signed off on a lot of messages, official messages, which came out under the CHOP or the signature of senior military personnel. They may not have written the note. I wrote the note in my example, but they gave their CHOP, they gave their signature, they signed off on the messages, giving it their endorsement. So whether General Nathan Twining wrote the Twining Memo or whether he signed off, gave his CHOP to the memo, it doesn't matter. He endorsed it. He believes in it. He believes in the content. And the Twining Memo stated quite succinctly, flying saucers are real and that they're not something that's visionary or fictitious. And then in the memo, there are paragraphs and passages that describe the shape of the craft. In those days, they were referred to as flying discs. The memo went on to describe the performance characteristics of these craft. And the memo was directed to Brigadier General George Shulgin, who at the time was an Air Force intelligence. It was basically a tasking from a higher commander, Air Material Command General Nathan Twining, to a lower level Air Force intelligence general telling him basically flying saucers are real, you have to study it, here is what you should look for. That is, in a nutshell, what the Twining memo is all about. Richard Dolan describes the Twining memo as one of the most important documents that's been coughed up via the Freedom of Information Act, and I would agree. Robert Hastings wrote a book called UFOs and Nukes. And this is an important subject because not only has the human military been interested in flying saucers, in alien craft, in non-human intelligences, but also we see the inverse of that. These intelligences that pilot these craft, the aliens, if you will, they have had a long-standing interest in the weapons development of the human military and the human governments on the planet. Robert Hastings' book, UFOs and Nukes, is all about this alien interest in the nuclear weapons capability of the United States and also, in truth, the weapons capabilities of other countries. But we have to backtrack once again, because like I said at the outset, I'm going to be going back and forth in time. Some of the documents that were coughed up via the Freedom of Information Act refer to events in the 1950s. And in fact, there's a document that came out specifically referring to a period in 1950 when scientists, military personnel, security personnel, pilots, and other highly credible witnesses were seeing again and again strange aircraft flying at high altitude and high speed over sensitive military and atomic energy installations. In the old days, what they used to call, what we now know as the Department of Energy, used to be known in America as the Atomic Energy Commission. And a lot of the different plants scattered throughout America would be responsible for various aspects of the nuclear weapons production. Some plants would be tasked with manufacturing weapons-grade fissionable uranium-235. Other plants would be responsible for creating plutonium-239, and then they would get the weapons-grade plutonium and uranium, send it off to other plants where it would be machined in the certain sizes and shapes where they would eventually make the pits or the cores of the nuclear weapons. Eventually, these weapons would be assembled, and then they would be shipped off to a place like Sandia military base in New Mexico. And then the custody would handover would occur where the Atomic Energy Commission would sign off, would give essentially the weapons that were manufactured to the military. The military would sign off, and they would become a part of the military arsenal. So as far back as the 1950s, there were already persistent reports and sightings over Atomic Energy Commission plants in Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where uranium was processed, so on and so forth. In fact, it was the era of what they called the green fireball mystery, because in a lot of these Atomic Energy Commission plants, these large green fireballs would be seen to fly at high speed, high altitude over these plants, and it was thought at the time by intelligence panels that were convened to study this phenomenon, one of which was called Project Twinkle, which involved Dr. Lincoln La Paz, who was a New Mexico meteorologist, a world-class meteor expert. Other people alleged to be involved in Project Twinkle, or at least their names are mentioned in the documentation, were Dr. Edward Teller and others. They got the sense that these green fireballs were flying over these sensitive Atomic Energy Commission plants doing sensing missions, that they were somehow obtaining intelligence by flying over and extracting some kind of information. And let's fast forward to 1975. 1975 was a big year as far as this alien interest in the nuclear weapons capability of humans, particularly of the American military. Within the UFO lore, there is the stories that came out of the strategic air command bases in the United States. There were two investigators in America, Barry Fawcett and Lawrence Greenwood, and they began petitioning the U.S. government via the Freedom of Information Act to provide as much information, documentation of documents, declassifying documents that had to do with UFOs, flying saucers, etc., etc. Out of this came a number of documents which described a series of incursions in the northern tier bases of Strategic Air Command. Loring Air Force Base in Maine, Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan, Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. These were all Strategic Air Command bases that had nuclear missiles, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. There has since been other people, Robert Peralta, if memory serves, that's his name, was an Air Force officer who worked in a launch control facility in Malmstrom, if memory serves. I could be wrong, don't quote me on that. But he's since gone public for many years now, talking about spaceships, flying saucers, hovering over nuclear missile silos. So there has been this persistent theme where this alien intelligence has always been interested in the nuclear weapons capability of the human race. Getting back to 1975, these sightings were witnessed by military personnel on the ground, including the so-called sabotage alert teams. These were highly trained security personnel whose job it was to guard nuclear facilities, nuclear launch control facilities, nuclear missile silos. In some of these eyewitness sightings, a large red glowing saucer-shaped object hovered quite close to the ground and basically scared, quite frankly, a lot of the security personnel. So all of this was written up in official memoranda and were sent out as priority messages to the National Command Authority. Fawcett and Greenwood called their book Clear Intent. It's since been renamed the UFO Cover-Up, but the original pressing it was called Clear Intent because in one of the documents, the craft were described as having a, quote, clear intent on the nuclear missile weapons storage areas. And we've seen this again, fast forwarding to December 1980, the infamous Rendlesham Forest, Bentwaters, Woodbridge events. RAF Bentwaters was an American base which had, at the time, a very large tactical nuclear weapons storage facility. And the locals there, going back centuries, always talked about strange happenings in the forest. Aliens, if you will, what they would have called maybe fairies or hobgoblins, whatever the case may be in the Middle Ages or other eras. But the people, the military people that were involved in the series of events that happened at least over 3 nights in late December 1980, right around the Christmas holidays, they also described these craft flying over the weapons storage areas and even shining lights down into the weapons storage areas. So the point of relevance here with Robert Hastings is he wrote an entire book about this subject, UFOs and Nukes, which I highly recommend. Again, it was not a subject of scientific curiosity. It was something that the National Command authorities were deeply concerned about because these craft and presumably the occupants within the craft had such an easy time penetrating restricted airspace over not just nuclear weapons plants where they were creating these weapons and creating the fissionable material, but hovering over the launch sites and the missile silos of the weapons themselves. Scientists and engineers. Some of you are familiar with this. I don't know why this story really doesn't have the kind of mileage, if you will, that other stories in the field does. I think it's one of the smoking guns of UFO research. This is Dr. Robert Sarbacher. Dr. Robert Sarbacher, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the story, but it bears repeating. He was an unpaid consultant for the Pentagon in the early 1950s. He specialized, in fact, he had his own company that dealt with missile development. He later became the dean of the Washington Institute of Technology, and he wrote a highly acclaimed book that dealt with the use of radio frequencies in engineering. He wrote what became known as the Sarbacher letter, and where he admits to researcher William Steinman. William Steinman was a researcher that was around in the early 1980s, and he developed his own sources. And what his sources told him was that, yes, there were a number of alien spacecraft crashes in the late 1940s and the 1950s. And so he began writing letters to Robert Sarbacher, basically pestering him in order for Sarbacher to basically admit or not admit to the fact that these crashes did occur. Now, there's a backstory to this. How did William Steinman find out that Robert Sarbacher knew about the retrieval and the back engineering of alien craft? Well, William Steinman had spoken to the widow of Wilbert Smith. Wilbert Smith was a Canadian government scientist for the Department of Transportation who was part of the Canadian government's UFO research program called Project Second Story. When Wilbert Smith passed away, William Steinman took the opportunity to visit the widow of Wilbert Smith and ask if he, William Steinman, can have access to the private papers of Wilbert Smith. An interesting story emerged. Sifting through all these papers, all of Wilbert Smith's personal papers, he came across a document that Wilbert Smith wrote to the Canadian government describing a meeting he had with a high-level U.S. scientist who talked about aliens and UFOs. And the 3 points that Smith made in the document were that this unnamed American scientist said flying saucers are real. The subject is the most highly classified at that time in the early 1950s, rating 2 points even higher than the hydrogen bomb. And a third point that was made in the memo was that a small group of scientists headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush was leading a research effort to find out more about the alien technology. Okay, so that's how William Steinman found out that this deceased Canadian official, Wilbert Smith, had somehow gotten in contact with an unnamed American scientist. Wilbert Smith went through the Canadian embassy in Washington, D.C., and an arrangement was made for him to meet this unnamed scientist. It turned out this unnamed scientist was Dr. Robert Sarbacher. And this is the Sarbacher letter. I don't know if you can see it, but I will read the contents of it. Okay, well, I'll read it, because you can find this on the internet. It's written on the letterhead of the Washington Institute of Technology, dated November 29, 1983. Addressed to Mr. William Steinman of La Mirada, California. Dear Mr. Steinman, I am sorry I have taken so long in answering your letters. However, I have moved my office and have had to make a number of extended trips. To answer your last question in your letter of October 14, 1983, there is no particular reason I feel I shouldn't or couldn't answer any or all of your questions. I am delighted to answer all of them to the best of my ability. You listed some of your questions in your letter of September 12th. I will attempt to answer that as you had listed them. 1. Relating to my own experience regarding recovered flying saucers, I had no association with any of the people involved in the recovery and have no knowledge regarding the dates of the recoveries. If I had, I would send it to you. 2. Regarding verification that persons you list were involved, I can only say this. John von Neumann was definitely involved. Dr. Vannevar Bush was definitely involved, and I think Dr. Robert Oppenheimer also. My association with the Research and Development Board under Dr. Compton, that's Dr. Carl Compton, during the Eisenhower administration was rather limited, so that although I had been invited to participate in several discussions associated with the reported recoveries, I could not personally attend the meetings. I am sure that they would have asked Dr. von Braun, and the others that you listed were probably asked or may not have attended. This is all I know for sure. Now, tracking down scientists, engineers, and etc., who have had first-hand involvement with the analysis of recovered alien craft is very much like spy catching. You find one scientist, and then if you interrogate the person correctly or develop a rapport with him or her, whatever the case may be, he or she may lead you to other scientists or personnel who likewise have first-hand information, first-hand knowledge of the recovered alien technology. Now, one of the individuals mentioned in that memo was Dr. Vannevar Bush. Dr. Vannevar Bush was a key individual in the weapons development capability of the United States military and the government, and associated research and development and corporations involved in weapons development in the run-up to and during and after World War II. Let me just pause and get a drink of water here. Everyone hear me okay? Yep. Dr. Vannevar Bush was from MIT, and he was an engineer, and he played a key role in setting up a number of committees to speed up the development of various weapon systems, including radar, including the proximity fuse. He set up the Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II, which was an umbrella organization which oversaw the efforts of a variety of weapons development programs. It was within the Office of Scientific Research and Development that a special department known as S1 was developed. S1 is what eventually became what we know as the Manhattan Project. Dr. Vannevar Bush was mentioned prominently in that document I just read that was written by Dr. Robert Sarbacher. And Dr. Vannevar Bush has also been implicated in the recovery and analysis of alien craft in the so-called Majestic 12 papers, among others. Dr. John von Neumann was a mathematician and a computer scientist. He played a key role in the development of modern computing, modern computational methods. He was a consultant also to the Manhattan Project, was alleged to have been involved in the Philadelphia experiment and the related Montauk experiment. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. Dr. John von Neumann was a world-class mathematician. He was colloquially known informally as one of the, what was the nickname that they gave them? There was a number of Hungarians during that time period. He was one of them. Edward Teller was another one, where they were so brainy and they were so out there as far as knowledge and intellect were concerned that they were hardly even regarded as human, basically. A personal friend of mine, Helga Morrow, who also has an interesting story as it relates to aliens and alien technology. Her father was Dr. Frederick Kepwars, and he was an emigre from Germany. He went to America in the 1930s, obtained a position within one of the aircraft corporations, which later morphed into a giant aerospace firm. And my friend Helga describes that meetings between her father, Dr. Kepwars, and Dr. John von Neumann, when she was a young girl, they would speak to each other in Dutch or some other language. She understood German at the time. So they purposely spoke in a foreign language which she could not understand. And it turned out later that according to Helga, that her father, Dr. Kepwars, admitted prior to what was apparently some kind of mental breakdown which could have been staged, that he himself was involved in alien research. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, Julius Robert Oppenheimer, he was the professor at Caltech, professor at Berkeley. He was involved in a lot of the early fast neutron research at Berkeley in the early stages of American involvement with the Manhattan Project. Later became a director of Los Alamos, where the plutonium implosion device and then the uranium device were developed. After World War II, he became the chairman of the General Advisory Commission of the Atomic Energy Commission, a very powerful position. he was not only mentioned in the Sarbacher memo, but he was also mentioned in documentation that was either, I can't remember if it was released by unknown sources within the military intelligence community, or if it was from documentation obtained via the Freedom of Information Act. In one of the documents, it was a message that was addressed to the Engineering and Power Plants Department at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. And in that message, it describes how Dr. Robert Oppenheimer was brought in as a consultant to look over what they thought might be an alien nuclear reactor system that was found within a recovered alien craft. Dr. Carl Compton was also mentioned in that memo. Dr. Carl Compton was a brother of Dr. Arthur Compton, who had received the Nobel Prize for his research into cosmic rays. Dr. Carl Compton was, at the time that Sarbacher refers to, was the director of the Joint Army-Navy Research and Development Board, which underwent a number of name changes. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, eventually they settled on the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA, which many of you have heard of. Dr. Carl Compton was the director of the Joint Army-Navy Research and Development Board, which played a key role in the analysis of recovered alien craft. And let's fast forward again. Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. If there was ever a guy who could be described as a super spook, this would be it. Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. He was a director of naval intelligence. He was at a later time in his career, he was a director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the Pentagon's in-house intelligence agency. It's an all-arms intelligence bureau. He later became a director of the National Security Agency, which is the worldwide global eavesdropping monolithic empire, the NSA. And then he became the deputy director of the CIA. He later went and joined the board of directors of the Science Applications International Corporation, based in San Diego, California, SAIC, as is known in the intelligence and the military world. He's basically a super spook, and his relevance in the story of UFOs involves the efforts by someone named Bob Exler. Bob Exler was a former NASA mission specialist who specialized in robotics. I don't know how Exler got the idea, but somehow he figured out that Admiral Bobby Ray Inman had something to do or knowledge of the recovery of alien craft and the study and analysis and the back engineering of alien craft. At the time of his tenure as director of the National Security Agency, Inman was in a facility, I believe it was in Maryland somewhere, to dedicate a new NSA building. And Bob Exler, the former NASA mission specialist, was waiting there to kind of ambush him. So after Admiral Inman gave his speech, etc., he was leaving the site, and Bob Exler comes up to him, hands him a business card and says, "My name is Bob Exler. I'd like to get to know you. I'd like to get closer to Majestic 12, or MJ 12. I can't remember what he said." Exler said that all Admiral Bobby Ray Inman did was smile, accept the card, and walk away. Well, sometime after that, Bob Exler got Admiral Bobby Ray Inman on the phone, and they had a discussion. And I heard the recorded phone discussion. And Bob Exler asked him, very clever how he worded the question. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Do you see a time when these recovered craft will be made available to the mainstream scientific community outside of military circles?" And Admiral Inman responded, and again I'm paraphrasing, 20 years ago I would have said no, but in the present time, maybe the climate has changed, maybe things have changed, So they would be more open to that. And what Bob Exler said afterwards was that was an extraordinary comment, because Inman was admitting that at least 20 years before, they had recovered alien craft, that it was in the possession of the powers that be. We now know that after the initial analysis by the various branches of the deep black elements of the military, a lot of this alien technology winds up in private, i.e. corporate hands, these large, monstrous aerospace corporations. So the significance of that statement, when Inman said, as far as this question of will these craft and technology be made available to the mainstream scientific community, he says, 20 years ago I would have said no, but now maybe the climate has changed. And from that he inferred, Exler and I infer, that Inman was admitting that yes, at least 20 years before that point in time, they had alien recovered craft in their possession. Of course, later, Admiral Bobby Ray Inman retracted and said that comment was taken out of context, even though he was recorded by Bob Exler.
What year was that?
That was, this discussion happened, I think, in the late 1980s. Now, what's also interesting about Bobby Ray Inman, to my knowledge, he was the first major figure to push the notion that virtually all sightings of alien craft were the result of the sightings of stealth technology, which is bogus, if you ask me, because stealth has to do with the radar cross-section, reducing the radar cross-section to such a point that ground-based and airborne radar cannot lock onto the radar cross-section of an airborne object long enough to either vector intercepting craft or to direct surface-to-air or aerial weapons platforms at the target. The radar cross-section has nothing to do with... He's taking the whole thing out of context, because an alien craft lighting up a whole countryside in the middle of the night is hardly stealthy. So when he says that these are just sightings of stealth, that's exploiting the ignorance of the general population, as well as the eagerness of debunkers and skeptics to seize on any explanation, right? That all of this is just due to stealth, which is patently absurd. One of the great UFO research pioneers of all time, Leonard Stringfield, was a former Air Force intelligence officer during World War II with the 5th Air Force in New Guinea and in the Philippines. He was a pioneer in what he referred to as retrievals of the third kind, the crash retrievals of alien spacecraft. He had developed a number of sources within the military and former members of the military intelligence community, as well as contractors, who told him over a span of many years about covert efforts by the deep black elements of the military as far as recovering crashed alien spacecraft. And some of his sources would describe seeing bodies kept in conditions of deep freeze in an underground facility. Wright Field, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base came up again and again in his discussions with a lot of the sources back then. Because in the early days, and still to this day, a lot of the recovered alien technology is brought to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So much, in fact, that they had to expand the operation to include the Kirtland-Sandia complex in New Mexico, and of course the infamous Green Lake complex in central Nevada. Leonard Stringfield's sources told him that as early as 1966, there were already at least 30 alien bodies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. 30 alien bodies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1966. He figures prominently later on as I move on to my story. Can someone give me a time check? What time is it right now?
After 3.
It's right after 3 p.m.?
5 to 3.
5 to 3. What time do you want to do a break, Joanne?
Soon. I'm thirsty, but it's up to you.
Okay, I can go for another, 10 minutes, is that okay? Okay.
And don't forget to come back after the break, everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
Some of you new people might not know.
Yeah, we're just taking a break because it's, kind of got a long haul here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah, just what, 15 minutes, thereabouts, 20 minutes? Okay. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, you're probably familiar with some of his story. He was a key player, talking about, he wrote a book called The Day After Roswell, about his knowledge of the aftermath of what happened at Roswell when one or more alien craft had crashed and various elements of the U.S. military covertly recovered said alien craft along with the bodies, living and dead. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso was a member of General Arthur Trudeau's Army Research and Development Division within the U.S. Army. And he claims in his book, I have no reason to doubt him, that he was tasked by General Arthur Trudeau to seed alien technology that the Army had acquired and seed it into the research and development centers, into the universities, into the corporations, without telling them the provenance of the technology, where it came from, and what exactly it is. What he would do was he would make arrangements to meet with officials from various R&D and centers and universities and corporations, give them the technology and say, here, do whatever you want with it, take out patents on it, whatever the case may be. And it must be understood that his book, The Day After Roswell, was not the be-all and the end-all of his career. He also testified before Congress, as he was a staffer for I can't remember the name, it escapes me right now, the National Security something or other, which was created in 1947 with the Defense Department Act. But he had testified before Congress about MIAs, missing personnel that were left over from Korea and Southeast Asia. And that's another hot button topic which has been endlessly covered up. Heaps of disinformation put out to basically whitewash the fact that thousands of American military personnel, in fact, if one goes back far enough, back to the closing days of World War II, when the Soviet Red Army basically shanghaied countless American soldiers that had strayed over into the Soviet sector. They were never seen again. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso testified before Congress about the MIA prisoner of war situation that developed out of Southeast Asia. So he wrote this book called The Day After Roswell, where he talks about the role he played in seeding alien technology into the universities and into the corporations. He describes shortly after Roswell an experience he had where he was at Fort Riley Army Base in Kansas, and he happened to stumble across a number of crates that were being transported by a military convoy, and looking inside one of the crates, he saw what he felt was the corpse of a non-human being, an alien, if you will. Of course, his most vociferous critics came from within the UFO community, the same culprits as usual. Dr. Kevin Randall, who made his name as being a Roswell researcher, and then he suddenly morphed into an alien abduction debunker and got a psychological degree on top of that to boot. And another guy was Stanton Friedman, who has made a career out of belittling the efforts and debunking the efforts of those people who come up with information which does not correspond with his own. And it's a good time right now to take a break. I'll talk about Bill Hamilton and the work he's done. Bill Hamilton was a linguist, a Russian linguist with the Air Force Security Service, which was the Air Force's National Security Agency subsidiary. And he had developed over the years a number of sources within the deep black aerospace corporations in the high desert of Southern California, where they actually not only back engineer the technology, but they make their own second generation, if you will, fleets of alien of craft based on artificial gravity, electrogravitics, electromagnetism, basically alien technology. So we'll take a break right now, and we'll see you again in about 15 minutes. Thank you. And once again, thank you for coming here. The person up on the screen now is Bill Hamilton. Bill Hamilton was a former member of the Air Force Security Service, the Air Force's NSA subsidiary, now known as the Air Force Electronic Security Command. And Bill was a Russian linguist, very smart guy, computer scientist, and basically a computer scientist, a computer programmer. And he was part of the early giant rock community. If you remember in the 1960s, in Giant Rock, Southern California, there would be these UFO conventions where literally thousands of people would show up, and there would be a variety of speakers. This was during the heyday of the so-called Contactee era, when many people were reporting encounters with beings that looked perfectly human. And these were not abductions. They would describe encounters with these beings. They would be taken on board their craft, shown things, flown around, returned, right? A lot of the more nuts and bolts minded researchers at the time, and still to this day, many of them scorn the whole concept of the contactees and the contactee era, but with the benefit of hindsight and with the passage of time, I am convinced, and many others are convinced, that many of those contacts were real, because a lot of the things that the contactees were told by these human-looking beings, a lot of it has since come to pass. And not only that, though, but a lot of the information they provided about how the ships were created, some of the alien ships, actually jive with what some of the sources within the aerospace corporations are saying. Over the years, Bill has been a top-level UFO investigator. He's investigated alien abductions. He's developed a number of sources in the Antelope Valley. The Antelope Valley is where the majority of America's aerospace corporations are based in the high desert of Southern California. It's also known as Aerospace Valley. Lockheed is there, a variety of other corporations, and most of them have underground facilities. Many of them are interlinked by the maglev trains and by tunnels, and a lot of the back engineering of the recovered alien craft is conducted at the Antelope Valley. And what they do is they test fly the craft straight from the Antelope Valley, or on occasion they will send the craft to places like Groom Lake in central Nevada and test fly them there. And Bill had developed a number of sources, like I said, within the aerospace community. Some of them have described seeing not only alien craft, but have described seeing non-human life forms in some of these underground bases in the Antelope Valley, as well as adjacent military bases like Edwards Air Force Base. There's a deep underground base beneath Edwards Air Force Base. Edwards used to be known as Muroc Field, which was where a lot of test flights were conducted for advanced craft. There's the Dryden Test Flight Center there now, and it's well known within the lore of UFO research that a lot of things have gone on at Edwards Air Force Base. Bill's sources describe people who interact with alien life forms on a daily basis in the underground bases. Aerospace workers, construction workers, scientists, and on occasion, what are known as MyLabs. MyLabs are legitimate alien abductees who on occasion, sometimes quite frequently, are kidnapped by deep black elements of the military and or aerospace community, taken underground, mind controlled, and are utilized as assets, operational assets. Oftentimes their surface level skill set will be exploited, whether they're in the medical field or they're in biochemistry or whatever the case may be. They may be used in a similar function in the underground bases. Other times these MyLabs will be used in a military capacity. They'll be trained with weapons. They'll be trained to operate certain types of technology, so on and so forth. Bill's wife, Pam, was a MILAB. She was at turns being taken by aliens and also taken by covert elements of the U.S. Air Force. On one occasion, a number of Air Force personnel had descended upon her house. She lived not too far from, I forget exactly where in the Antelope Valley, the northern part she lived in, I believe. And the military showed up, and she engaged in a shoving match with a female Air Force member. They were pushing her around, and she was quite shaken up by the ordeal. On another occasion, Pam was abducted by these aliens, and they took her on a ship. And then she was looking out a porthole, and then she looked as the craft was descending, and then she saw in the side of this mountain, which I believe Bill identified as Tehachapi Mountain. Beneath Tehachapi Mountain is a large underground facility, a large aerospace facility known by the locals as the anthill because of all the tunnel systems within this mountain. Northrop Corporation, which later merged with Grumman to form Northrop Grumman, had this large, or probably still has, this large underground facility within this mountain. And Pam remembers looking through a porthole, seeing a hole open up within this mountain, and within this hole she saw like a landing pad with a number on it, I believe number 41. The craft descended, and then she found herself in this underground facility. On another occasion, his wife Pam, and he wrote a whole chapter about Pam's experiences in one of his books. I think the chapter was called The Perils of Pamela. And she described another incident when suddenly her house there, it was a remote part of the high desert, which they only know as a coastal route. And it's a rather isolated place. She suffered a power outage, and then next thing you know, she looks up and she's laying in bed, and she sees a man in like a black SWAT uniform, a black ball cap, black BDUs, battle dress utilities, and he was holding a black box with wires sticking out of it, and he said something about there's no power here, right? And next thing you know, she hears her dog barking. She gets up to investigate, and she sees on a second-story landing in her house, was like a multi-story house, on either like a veranda or on a roof of her house, she sees a Chinese-American Air Force personnel, some kind of special operations unit. He had an identifiable flash or insignia. He had a canine with him, a German Shepherd, that was barking at her dog. She was worried that her dog would be mauled by this military dog. And this Chinese-American Air Force guy was screaming at gray aliens that were on the ground, and he was yelling at the grays, "Damn it, get her out of here," her being Pam. And so, around that time, a large craft hovered over the house, and the craft was emitting this kind of mist, kind of cloaking itself. I myself have seen actual alien craft create cloud banks in which to hide it. So that was another one of Pam's experiences. So Bill's experiences cover the gamut from the early Contactee era, his own experiences with human-looking, highly advanced beings, the sources he developed at places like Edwards Air Force Base and the aerospace facilities, and then what he learned from his wife's ordeals with the various types of ETs she encountered, including a reptilian, which regarded his wife as the reptilian's mate. In fact, on one occasion, we used to have what was known as the UFO friendship campouts at the Little Ailey Inn in Rachel, Nevada, which is adjacent to Area 51. And Rachel at the time, I don't know about now, it was just a half a dozen or more trailers, basically. And for the big 3-day weekends and weekend holidays in America, Labor Day, 4th of July weekend, etc., the proprietors of the Little Ailey Inn Bar, formerly the Rachel Bar and Grill, Joe and Pat Travis, would have the UFO Friendship Campout, where a number of speakers, including myself, would give lectures and we tell stories. This is where I first met George Maxwell. Well, it was one of the places I met him. And on one particular evening, we decided to do a sky watch. And so I waited outside Bill and Pam's trailer. Nobody came out. I was out there alone. No one else showed up. There were supposed to be several of us. I was out there by myself. I saw 6 craft leave the test site, luminescent elliptical shape, fly over my head. 2 of them were zigzagging silently and flew over my head relatively, well, basically they were noiseless, no noise whatsoever, and they flew off to the northeast. And I'm standing there outside Bill's trailer. Now, after a while, I gave up and I went back to my trailer. I guess I had my sighting anyway. Little did I know that while I was standing outside of the Hamiltons' trailer, Pam was having an encounter with a reptilian indoors. So at the same time I was there, just inside this trailer, his wife, Pam, was having an encounter with a reptilian. Bill had spent a lot of time debriefing a number of sources within the aerospace community. One of his sources was a former U.S. Marine who took part in a crash retrieval in the early stages of Americans' involvement in Southeast Asia in 1958. A saucer was recovered in Southeast Asia. It was placed on the deck of the carrier USS Oriskany. A tarp was placed over it, and it was brought back, I believe, to, at the time, Naval Air Station Alameda, which is adjacent to San Francisco. He developed other sources that actually were in contact with alien beings, with non-human life forms in these underground bases. And Bill tells a story of how they actually sat down this alien on a computer in some other location, and Bill had a chat room discussion with a non-human life form. It was an alien. Apparently, it looked quite human. So perhaps I'll get back to Bill's story later. His stories alone, well, he's written a number of books, which I highly recommend. Cosmic Top Secret and Alien Magic are 2 of them. Bill Uhouse. Now, one of Bill Hamilton's sources was Dan Burish. Dan Burish, some of you may be familiar with the story. You can find his story on YouTube. I believe Kerry Cassidy from Project Panel. I interviewed Dan Burish. Dan Burish claimed to be a microbiologist working at S4 in central Nevada. S4 was a highly secure underground base, and Dan Burish was working with an alien in a clean room environment, some kind of a sphere, and Dan Burish referred to these aliens that he was exposed to as the J-Rods. Well, as fate would have it, another whistleblower came forward named Bill Uhouse. Bill Uhouse has since passed away. Bill Uhouse was formerly in the U.S. Marine Corps. He was also an engineer. He worked on developing a flight simulation navigation system based on the craft, the alien craft that had come down in my old stomping grounds in Kingman, Arizona in 1953. That craft was recovered by the military. Eventually it wound up in central Nevada. And Bill Uhouse says that it was 3 years before he and his team even realized what they were working on. They were developing a flight simulator based on the craft that was recovered in Kingman, Arizona. And he also described working at S4 in central Nevada, where one of his colleagues was a non-human being, an alien, which he called J-Rod, similar to what Dan Burish refers to as the J-Rods. Well, Bill Uhouse drew a detailed drawing of one of these J-Rod beings that he interacted with almost on a daily basis. Bill Uhouse said that Dr. Edward Teller used to show up every now and then at S4. Dr. Edward Teller has figured prominently in the research. Bob Lazar, who I will talk about shortly, describes basically being recruited by Dr. Edward Teller into this secret space program. So Bill Uhouse is another individual who describes, in the course of his duties, working with an actual alien in an underground base. Ben Rich, some of you are familiar with the story, but it bears repeating. Ben Rich was the director of Skunk Works, which was the Advanced Development Division, Advanced Projects Development Division within Lockheed. It was under the auspices of Skunk Works that they developed all these next generation fighter planes and spy planes, including the U-2, the SR-71, the alleged Aurora craft, and a number of other so-called hypersonic craft. If anyone would know about the actual hardware, the actual hands-on alien technology, it would have been Ben Rich. And he mentioned on a couple of occasions, one time in a public lecture in the Southern California University in front of an audience of engineers and the like, he made a cryptic statement at the end of his lecture. We now have the means to bring ET home, right? Now, that statement went over the heads of a lot of the people in the audience, quite frankly. But a handful of people, several, stuck around after the lecture, and they cornered Ben Rich, and they asked him, what did you mean by that? What do you mean we have the means to bring ET home, right? And he went on to say that they've developed technology over the years which allows them to travel to stars. Now, Ben Rich gave what amounted to a deathbed confession to Tom Keller, who was an aerospace consultant with the Mutual UFO Network. It amounted to a deathbed confession. And Ben Rich admitted, yes, there are UFOs. There are man-made UFOs, and there are alien UFOs, essentially. He said that the military now travel to stars. It does not take lifetimes. That there was an error in the equations, but they've corrected those equations. And now the military travels to stars fairly routinely. He said that they've now developed, and this was, I don't remember when he passed away, perhaps the early 90s, but he told Tom Keller that they've developed a small fleet of advanced craft based on alien technology. I would beg to differ. I believe by this point they've developed a large fleet of craft based on alien technology. I myself have seen many craft that I would regard as being man-made, based on electrogravitics, artificial gravity, field propulsion. It should be pointed out that one of the rocket scientists and engineers who was a mentor to Werner von Braun, Hermann Oberth. Hermann Oberth became a consultant to the U.S. Army's Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama missile development program. And Hermann Oberth was quoted in the past as saying that flying UFOs, flying saucers, travel at the immense speeds they do and make instantaneous turns without killing the occupants inside the craft, because these craft are able to generate their own artificial gravity fields. And that's what Hermann Oberth said. And then here's Ben Rich, years later, confirming that they have developed in these aerospace corporations knockoffs, basically, of actual alien craft. It should be noted that for years there have been, there have been many engineers and scientists here on Earth who understood the principles of electrogravitics, magnetism, electromagnetism, artificial gravity. People like Dr. T. Townsend Brown, Thomas Townsend Brown, John Searle, who was a civilian, just a plain civilian in England, who basically was developing on his own artificial gravity. So the principles of gravity fields, generating gravity fields, electromagnetism was well understood for many years. In fact, the aforementioned Bill Hamilton had developed in his own garage basically a little craft that operated on electrogravitic principles. And he always made the point that if me and my friends can make something like this in our garage, what can these aerospace corporations do? with their immense resources, unlimited grant funding, et cetera, et cetera. Another interesting point that came out in Bennewitz's deathbed confession was he was asked how the, he was asked by Tom Keller how the navigation worked. And I'm paraphrasing here. And Ben Rich said, "I'll ask you a question. How does ESP work?" And then Tom Keller said that all time and space is one, right? Ben Rich said, "Exactly. That's how it's done. That what we would call ESP, extrasensory perception, has something to do with the navigation of these craft. That these beings have the ability to interface instantaneously, either naturally through their own kind of advanced telepathic means, or with some kind of cybernetic hookup, or a combination thereof, because the turns and the alterations of course that they make, which are super fast and instantaneous, it would be quite difficult for someone thinking just along normal lines like we do to be able to create such instantaneous turns without some kind of extra means. So Ben Rich basically stated that telepathy, extrasensory perception, etc., has something to do with the navigation and the control of these craft. What's interesting is what the so-called discredited contactees of the 50s and the 60s said also jives with what some of Bill Hamilton's sources within the Aerospace Corporation said, that some of these craft are what we would call organic technology. They're grown in a chemical bath. They grow, the compartments within it differentiate, and the occupants of the craft have an instantaneous connection to the technology. If they want a porthole to appear over here, a porthole appears. If they want a ramp to appear over here, or stairs to appear over here, which descend outside the craft, a ramp and or stairs will manifest. Everything is pretty much instantaneous as far as some of the civilizations are concerned. So Ben Rich's testimony is key. Again, he was a director of Skunk Works. He was a protege of Kelly Johnson, who was the founder of the Skunk Works. Under Kelly Johnson, Lockheed developed the P-38 Lightning and a number of other airplanes that are quite famous in aircraft lore. Bob Lazar. Once again, Bob Lazar's most vociferous critics came from within the UFO field. Whenever some of these guys risk their life and pop up and say they work within the system, helping to back engineer alien technology, whatever the case may be, it's all these ego-driven UFO researchers who are the first to pounce. Bob Lazar, and what's interesting about Bob Lazar, similar to what happened to a number of so-called atomic veterans and other people involved in what we would call black operations, where their records, their military records, their school records, everything is expunged, everything disappears, and they attempt to make the people like non-credible by making their records disappear. They did the same thing to Lazar. He was trained at Caltech, and he worked at Los Alamos, and he had a Q security clearance. He said he worked in aspects of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, weapon systems, at Los Alamos, at the Mason Physics Lab. What's interesting is people in Los Alamos, off the record, say yes, he worked there. The person who studied, who researched Bob Lazar, investigative reporter George Knapp for KLAS television in Las Vegas, actually obtained an in-house Los Alamos phone directory with Bob Lazar's name listed on it. George Knapp actually found a source that had formerly worked at S4 where Bob Lazar claimed to work. And this source was initially skeptical about Bob Lazar, spoke with Bob Lazar, and after speaking with Bob Lazar, he told George Knapp, yes, he used to work there, because I asked him very specific questions. How do you pay for the food? How do you get from this place to that place? Can you describe the layout of this place? And it must be understood that the people that work at a place like S4 underground in central Nevada, they're only allowed access to certain places, certain floors, certain departments. They don't have blanket access. Everything is strictly compartmented. It's a very harsh military oppressive regime where they're trailed constantly by security guards. It used to be, I don't know about now, but Wackenhut Corporation used to hire a lot of the security drawn from the ranks of the Special Forces, the Navy SEALs, et cetera, and they would make up the interior and the interior and exterior security of the facility at Groom Lake and at S4. And according to this other source that George Knapp developed, he said Bob Lazar answered correctly in every instance that he must have been in those places, because otherwise he would never have known about them. Now, what did Bob Lazar say? Bob Lazar said that he was recruited basically by Edward Teller, the aforementioned Edward Teller, and he found himself working within the Papoose mountain range. S4 is within the Papoose Mountains. Many people know about the Groom Mountains, 15 miles to the north. The Papoose mountain range is 15 miles further south. And within the mountain range is this underground complex that's been developed. And if you're familiar with Bob Lazar's story, he says that along the side of one side of this mountain range are a number of hangars. And the hangars are painted to match the color of the desert. And these were big hangar bay doors that would open up, and there were 9 of them, and inside each hangar bay was a separate, unique craft. And he worked on a particular craft, which he referred to as a sport model, because it looked very sleek, it was saucer-shaped. And at first he said, and I met Bob Lazar, and like many scientists, he's quite skeptical. To this day, perhaps he still has some doubts about some of the more lurid tales that people tell regarding aliens and UFOs and whatnot. But he said when he first saw the disc that he later worked on, he told himself that this must be where all the stories of flying saucers are coming from. The government has had them all along, right? Well, they have had them all along, but in this case, it was an actual alien craft. And he knew it was an alien craft because on one occasion he was granted access to the interior, the middle part of the craft, and he said that the chairs inside the craft were very small, so they were either intended for children or a very small being. And he says obviously they're not intended for children. He said everything had a rounded edge on the interior, almost as if it was injection molded. There was no sharp edges inside. It was all very sparse, all very Spartan, utilitarian inside. He said there were 3 main facets to the craft. The underside of the craft had what he called the gravity amplifiers. He was a physicist, a theoretical physicist, and he was tasked with learning about the propulsion system and the energy source, right? So we learned a lot about Bob Lazar because the particular race that craft had come from was a race from the Zeta Reticuli star system, which is about 37 light years from our solar system. And in a nutshell, and you can find the story online, he says that the Zeta Reticulians and probably other ET races have access to naturally occurring substances, minerals, if you will, in their worlds which are unattainable here. The Zeta Reticuli star system is a binary star system, if memory serves, and so they have naturally occurring substances there, including what he calls element 115, which is used as the fuel source to power the craft that he worked on. So, in a nutshell, what happens is that source, element 115, emits what he calls a gravity A wave, which can be accessed and amplified and utilized to warp tremendous distances of space. He says that traveling in space has nothing to do with traveling at or near the speed of light in a linear mode. He says, at least as far as this particular civilization is concerned, it has everything to do with focusing the gravity amplifiers beneath the craft at a distant point in space, powering it up, and literally pulling that distant point in space towards the craft itself, shutting off the the gravity amplifiers, and suddenly they are in that distant location. So they arrived there through warping and folding, essentially, the distances, rather than going there in a linear fashion. And so Bob Lazar is another source we have from within the system who has come out. He's been subjected to a lot of harassment, and he claims he was shot at one time when he was driving. They basically wrecked his marriage. They basically, for a while, tried to ruin his life. And I did meet him on one occasion when he gave a speech at one of the UFO friendship campouts. A very important witness who's come forward. And according to John Lear, who knew him very well, John Lear is a former CIA covert operations pilot. His father is the same Lear who developed the Learjet. And John Lear developed his own sources within the intelligence community and the military regarding alien craft, UFOs, and whatnot. And John Lear says that privately Bob Lazar told him things that Bob Lazar did not tell the public. Bob Lazar told him there is a base on Mars, that the deep black government, the military aerospace community, has a presence on Mars and has had a presence on Mars for some time. Although Bob Lazar will never talk about that publicly. Bob Lazar also told John Lear he saw what he thought was an alien at the facility he worked at. But publicly he will say that he could have seen like a small puppet, or he could have seen like a small model of a small being, right? But he will not come out publicly and say that he saw an alien. Although apparently, according to John Lear, Lazar did say that he thought he saw an alien at S4. That's yours truly to the right of Bob Lazar, wearing the green cap there. Bob Lazar in the middle. That's Gary Schultz to the right next to Bob Lazar. Gary Schultz used to conduct what he called the secret saucer expeditions. He would lead a convoy of vehicles and drive right up to the gate there at Groom Road, and he took a great photo of a flying disc there one night when he was there by himself. He and his secret saucer expeditions were so irksome to the authorities that they would buzz the convoys and their cars with helicopters. In fact, it's probably due to Gary Schultz and people like him that they extended the security perimeter and took over more land that formerly was part of the Bureau of Land Management, which was then absorbed by the facility, the Area 51 facility. John Vasquez. I knew John Vasquez personally. He's since passed away. I spent an entire weekend debriefing him. In a nutshell, John Vasquez was a soldier based at Fort Benning, Georgia. Fort Benning, Georgia is the home of the U.S. Infantry Training School. It's where and they also have advanced infantry training at Fort Benning, Georgia. Memory serves that they also have a contingent of U.S. Army Rangers there. And Vasquez says that in September 1977, he was out in parade formation with his entire battalion one night. Early, it was dusk, starting to become nighttime. And in a nutshell, his entire battalion was subject to a mass alien abduction. And he recalls being underneath one of the barracks, hiding out with some of his army friends, because there was all these craft that were descending. Aliens had actually gotten out of the craft. According to some other sources who have since come out, there have been at least 2 other people who have since come out and talked about this experience in September 1977 at Fort Benning, Georgia, that there was an actual shootout, and we've heard these stories before, shootout between the U.S. military and these aliens. Not only aliens shooting from craft, but aliens on the ground as well. There's a similarity there with the Bentwaters incident, the aforementioned Royal Air Force Bentwaters, where the U.S. Air Force had a base and where there was a large repository of tactical nuclear weapons, and the nearby twin base of RAF Woodbridge there at the Rendlesham Forest, that Much of that account has been minimalized because, quite frankly, there's always been an anti-alien element within the UFO field. There are many people who would like to keep everything at a lights in the sky, kind of will-o'-the-wisp level, where it's non-confronting. It's just a transient phenomena, lights in the sky, very brief radar painting of a craft. Something happened, maybe something didn't. And a lot of researchers want to keep it at that level. And there's been a long-going anti-alien bias in the field itself. Larry Warren was one of the key witnesses at RAF Bentwaters. He was an Air Force security policeman, and on the third night of the events there, he was in a clearing with about 40 other personnel when they surrounded a landed alien craft, and alien life forms actually got out of the craft. They began sending away the lower level personnel, and according to Larry Warren, the wing commander, General Gordon, I forget what his last name, was present when these aliens got out of the craft. And since then, there's been a lot of slanderous attacks against Larry Warren. They've coerced or otherwise suborned all these other witnesses to say negative things about Larry Warren. And the only difference between Warren's account and the other accounts is Warren says there were aliens there. Now, there is a book called The Humanoids, which is a classic in the field. It's basically an anthology, each chapter written by a different UFO researcher, and it was written in the early 1970s. And there are chapters in that book which describe case after case of a landed craft, occupants seen outside the craft. And the witnesses vary from policemen to farmers, to citizens that just happened to be in a certain place when there was a landed craft and aliens outside of the craft. Well, what Larry Warren described is essentially no different than that. The craft descended, aliens got out of it, he witnessed it, and he was subjected to a lot of harassment and mind control. In fact, Larry says he was taken to an underground base beneath his base, RAF Bentwaters, and subjected to mind control, and he said that a number of others have also. One of the witnesses who has tried to, it seems, debunk Larry Warren was Sergeant Jim Penniston, who himself describes being taken and given an injection and drugged and they tried to make him forget what he'd seen. Now, Penniston won't come out and say aliens were present, although, according to Warren, Penniston knew better. So it was an example of the powers that be using other witnesses and turning them against Warren and making him seem like he was the attention seeker, he was the odd man out, and he was the guy whose account is different from everyone else's, right? When actually his was the most valid account. And the point of similarity with John Vasquez is it's another example of not only the military having an interaction with aliens, but in Vasquez's case, an entire battalion of infantrymen were subjected to a mass alien abduction. He says the aftermath, very similar to what Warren and others described, was the following. Army psychologists began showing up, conducting narco-hypnosis on a number of the people, a number of the personnel, and in a number of, as was the case in a number of other instances, when there was a low-level UFO alien flyby or landing encounter, before the dust settled, the next morning, after the debriefings and after the narco-hypnosis was exerted, a number of the soldiers were sent off to different parts of the world, the far-flung coast, all over the place. And this is standard operational procedure after such an event. They send them out all over the place, different duty stations, so they can't compare notes, so they can't kind of form what kind of faction. And John Vasquez, and again, I spent an entire weekend with him. I spent 13 hours on a Saturday talking with him about his experiences. They went to the extent of putting it out in the local media there in Georgia that a measles outbreak had occurred at Fort Benning, Georgia, at the time of the alien landing and the mass abduction. I hope that John was still alive when these other witnesses had come forward as vindication and validation for him. Paul Bennewitz, again, a so-called controversial figure in the field, but not really controversial. Paul Bennewitz was an independent scientist, and he was observing with his own eyes, and he developed technology which he claimed intercepted alien communications. He lived in New Mexico, and he observed a lot of alien activity, UFO activity, in the Archuleta Mesa area of northern New Mexico, not too far from the infamous Dulce underground base, if some of you are familiar with that story. Like I said earlier, a lot of the alien technology, they first would take it to the nearest base, and then when it was recovered, the alien technology, and then it would wind up in a place like White-Patterson Air Force Base. But they had acquired so much alien technology over the years that they had to kind of spread the wealth to different military facilities. And one of those places was the Kirtland Air Force Base complex near Albuquerque, New Mexico, as well as the Sandia military base not too far from that, collectively known as the Kirtland-Sandia complex. Sandia, again, I mentioned earlier how the civilian Department of Energy, like I said, Dulce Base is not too far away. And the Native Americans, the Apaches in this case, at the nearby Jicarilla Indian Reservation, it's sweltering these signals and finding out what they were all about. Well, he made a mistake. I guess he was dangerously naive or something. I think eventually they would have found out about it, but he really compounded his problem by bringing his information and his findings to the Air Force at Kirtland Air Force Base. And it wasn't too long before he became the subject of surveillance, harassment, psychological warfare operations, so on and so forth. The Office of Special Investigations, OSI, within the Air Force, played a role in, like the MILABs I was just describing. Legitimate alien abductees who were kidnapped, harassed, mind-controlled, abused in many cases by covert elements of the military. So one of my beeps against the disclosure movement is they are not addressing this compensation issue. Right? It's all well and good for them to throw us a bone and say, yeah, they're here, but that's all we're going to tell you. When there's been people like myself and countless others who've been screaming, at the tops of our lungs that they're here and that these beings are having an impact on our daily life. Well, John Ford is one such individual. John Ford is the founder of the Long Island UFO Network. Running out of time, so I'll quickly wrap up his case. John Ford is a political prisoner in the U.S. He and his team investigated two separate crashes. Actually, the first crash, September, I wrote it down, September 28, 1989, the Mauritius Bay near Long Island. What happened was that a weapon that was based at Brookhaven National Labs was deployed by the military to shoot down a large triangular-shaped alien craft. It landed, or it crashed at Mauritius Bay. The military came and retrieved it. Eyewitnesses saw two large double-rotored helos, perhaps a C-47 Chinook, or maybe like a Sea Knight type of a C-58, something with like double rotors. And C-47 definitely has a double rotor. Don't quote me on the Sea Knight. But whatever the helicopters were, between the two of them, they had a large cargo net, and the craft was placed between the two helicopters, and the craft was flown out. According to the aforementioned Leonard Stringfield sources, that craft wound up at Fort Meade, Maryland, which is the base of the headquarters of the National Security Agency. His team also investigated what's known as the South Haven UFO crash in November 24, 1992, South Haven Park, Long Island. A cigar-shaped craft was seen by eyewitnesses tumbling end over end in the sky, crashed in South Haven Park. And the firefighters got there, as was the case in a number of other crashes. December 9, 1965, Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. The first people on the scene was was a civilian firefighting unit, right? There's actually I think a 1980 U.S. Federal Firefighting Handbook, guidebook, an entire chapter about recovering crashed alien spacecraft and the radiological dangers which may be encountered by the firefighting crews, right? So anyway, South Haven Park in 1992, the cigar-shaped craft crashes. Firefighters get there. One of them took film, videotape of some of the burning wreckage. The military shows up. Some of the eyewitnesses who refused to be named said there was military activity around the park for days. For days after this event, they were suffering power outages, problems with their electronic devices, etc., etc. Well, long and the short of it was John Ford, as director of the team that was investigating these two crashes in Long Island, was set up on a phony charge of threatening to assassinate the head of the Republican Party in Suffolk County, New York. And to this day, he's languishing in jail. He's basically a political prisoner. So, again, if we're talking about disclosure, people like John Ford have to be taken into account. We can't just be fobbed off with concepts of like, okay, they're here, so on and so forth. And one last thing I'll say before I let you go here is disclosure was already happening in Russia. Many years ago, people like Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut in space, was very outspoken about his belief in aliens and UFOs, and what his colleagues and cosmonauts have told him about their own personal sightings of the UFOs in space. Dr. Marina Popovich, who holds dozens of records as a test pilot and a cosmonaut, she herself is very outspoken about aliens, about alien life forms, about UFOs. In fact, she provided this photo of the infamous Phobos 2 photograph. Phobos 2 was a space probe the Russians had sent out, which disappeared as it approached Phobos, one of the moons of Mars, and I believe, as many believe, that Phobos is actually an artificial satellite, similar to our moon, similar to the Iapetus, which is an artificial satellite for Saturn. You have to look it up on the Enterprise website by Richard Hoagland, but he does a great write-up about why Iapetus is an artificial moon. Anyway, the Russians sent this satellite towards Phobos. It disappeared, but before it disappeared, it sent back this photo of a very long cylindrical object, estimated to be about 15 kilometers long. So, disclosure, Dr. Eugene Plotnikov, a Russian, he studies anti-gravity, superconductors, electromagnetism, etc., etc. And the Russian National Academy of Sciences is openly working on anti-gravity, artificial gravity, field propulsion, etc., etc. Whereas in America and in the West, it's all bass-backwards. Bass-backwards is a level of stupidity above ass-backwards, right? What they do in America is they want to keep everything at this kind of nuts and bolts level, the stealth, the U-2, the SR-71, everything based on the thrust propulsion, right? Anything out of that boundary is considered quack science, is considered quackery. When in fact, the Deep Black Aerospace corporations have been working on field propulsion, electromagnetic for decades. I already talked about some of the other whistleblowers and whatnot who come out of these programs and spoken about it. So disclosure has already happened in Russia, as far as I'm concerned. Now, in a disclosure summit a few days ago in Canada, I'll leave you with this thought. There is an individual who came forward, Victor Viniagi, I can't pronounce his last name, it's Italian. But, what is it?
Vigiani?
Vigiani, yes. He obtained, via the Freedom of Information Act from the Canadian government, 6 pages of documentation which refers to UFO jet intercepts, which refers to, I believe, the recovery of alien craft that the Canadian government has been involved in. And there have been some big cases in Canada involving, crash or disabled craft. the Shag Harbor incident, and you can look that up. And also, Victor talked about within these documents, there were passages describing communications between the pilots of these interceptors and the occupants of some of these craft they were intercepting. And we've heard similar stories coming from jet fighter pilots and whatnot in the U.S. and elsewhere. So it's possible, it's been rumored about, that NASA may make some kind of announcement, because NASA is desperately trying to hang on to any shred of legitimacy they have left. Because thanks to the internet, and thanks to private researchers and whistleblowers, et cetera, well, frankly, we don't need NASA anymore. We are disclosure. So NASA may come out with an announcement, but it'll be a limited hangout in intelligence terms. It will not be the full story. Of course it will not be. But they have to try to hang on to any shred of legitimacy, because they have to retain control of this, because it's getting too widespread. There's too many people who are talking. There are too many people who know things. So I hope that you enjoyed my talk, and I'll be going down, downstairs to have a meal here in a little bit. So any one of you that want to come by and have a chat afterwards, that would be great. And then thank you for coming here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.